Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhearn.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. So this week we have a philosophical question. And this is one of these things that philosophers have pondered for decades now. Do you really need Photoshop anymore? I'm old enough to remember back in the day, the app for working with photos was Photoshop. There weren't many alternatives. If they were things like, what's that open source thing with the funny name, the abbreviation?
Oh, I could have told you before you asked me. GIMP, G-I-M-P.
GIMP.
Yes.
Right. GIMP, GNU image processor?
Or
something like that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But Photoshop was the thing. I mean, going back in the day, well, we didn't have photos on our computer. So if we go to the sort of the pre-digital camera days, we didn't really have photos. Some people scanned them. But even the early days of digital photos, I guess we had iPhoto back then?
No, I think, early days, there would have been no iPhoto back then.
Early 2000s.
I mean, basically, like you either had Photoshop or you had Photoshop Elements, which was like Photoshop Light.
Photoshop Elements, that's right.
And so Photoshop Elements was the consumer version of Photoshop. Basically, like let's strip out a whole lot of the complicated stuff and still give you the basics of being able to work with digital photos. And I think when
it was pretty limited.
It was pretty limited. It's actually less limited now. It still doesn't have a lot of the advanced stuff, but it is a thing that you can get right now.
I didn't know it still existed.
Oh, yeah. Still exists. It's come a long way. So I wrote several books about Photoshop Elements back in the day. I took one over from an author who couldn't do it anymore and then made a few variations of that. And then there was another one that I took over from two other authors who couldn't do it at the time. And so basically Photoshop Elements has come a long way, but I don't know how well it does nowadays because when it came to like doing stuff on your Mac, iPhoto came out. Windows has always had a very rudimentary version, which I think maybe they also called Photos. Basically, if you were a photographer and you were working with digital photos, then you pretty much had to have Photoshop because Photoshop was the thing that would let you do your editing, kind of full stop. And I think that's why people got Photoshop Elements because it had Photoshop in the name. And it circulated that if you were a photographer, you needed Photoshop. Like that was the thing. Even if there were other tools, it was Photoshop. And I think that still kind of applies, but in a very, very, very small way.
I don't know. I rarely hear anyone talk about Photoshop. It's Lightroom now. Enthusiast photographers talk about. Photoshop is the thing that they don't want to mess with because it's too complicated. But Lightroom is the tool that they use that is, I want to say, more features than Photoshop Elements and less complex than Photoshop. I do want to point out though that Photoshop Elements lets you edit with the magic of AI, create with stylish effects and templates, and be creative on the go. But it's a 3-year term license. I mean, Adobe, come on.
Yeah.
You used to sell that on a normal license and people would buy it and upgrade or not. It's £87, which is actually quite expensive for something like that. If you compare it to, say, Pixelmator or, one of the other, I want to say, fairly full-featured apps available for Mac.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is I want to say last year, so 2023 or 2024, until that point, Photoshop Elements was the last of their whole line that you could just buy, like straight up buy, not a license, not a subscription, nothing. And then they finally threw in the towel and they said, well, we're not going to make it a perpetual subscription the way the rest of the Adobe suite is, but you're going to get this yearly license or whatever it is. So there were a lot of people who got Photoshop Elements because they could just own it outright.
I remember it being 30 or 40 euros when I was in France. And I did have a few versions of it. I rarely used it, but it was the kind of thing I would buy to have, partly because maybe I was writing something and I needed to talk about something, or the occasional photo editing that I did. But I mean, God, the Adobe Industrial Complex is just...
Yeah.
I just... there's very little I just don't want to do stuff with Adobe. But, that's one of the main reasons that philosophers have come up with. Socrates talked about this in one of his dialogues, saying that you don't need to use Photoshop because you can avoid the Adobe Industrial Complex.
I remember reading the original translation of that. Yes.
Yes.
But that aside, so that history bit, we mentioned this at the end of our last episode, and I find this to be an interesting development. So when we recorded the last episode, Adobe had just announced Photoshop for iPhone.
I believe on the day we recorded, and we didn't discuss it, this was when we recorded the episode about the Leica Lux grip and app, and we didn't discuss it because it had just come out. You didn't have time to look at it at all.
Exactly. And it's interesting because if you have followed anything about digital photography, you might say to yourself, what do you mean? There have been several Photoshops for iPhone. And that's true. This is the first time, like actual Adobe Photoshops, not just things that act like Adobe Photoshop, but Adobe has had this really long process. There was, I think, Photoshop Express was one thing. And this is the first time that it's actual capital P Photoshop. Like this is the Photoshop app on iPhone.
Capital P?
Capital P for Photoshop. Photo starts with a PH.
Right. It sounds like an F. Made me just think, it doesn't sound like a P. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, dear listeners,
My bad.
to reveal that Kirk actually does not know how to spell anything despite being a professional writer for his entire career.
Well, but also the original Greek dialogue with Socrates had it spelled with an F.
Oh, right. Okay.
They didn't use PH.
That's fair. That's fair. So. And the S was the F-looking S from anyway. We're okay. So to get back into things, you also may be thinking, well, wait a minute, wasn't there a Photoshop released a couple of years ago? And that was Photoshop for iPad. And that only ran on the iPad. So like this whole Photoshop thing has been very piecemeal. And I would say for some good reason, because Photoshop is a complicated, advanced tool. And to squeeze that down into an iPhone interface, that's a difficult thing to do. I mean, I think a lot of people, myself included, Photoshop can do amazing things. And before Lightroom came around, you had to know how to do all this. And you had to know how to manipulate layers. And you had to – there are just so many parts of it. I know people who have made entire careers on how to do Photoshop stuff. Trying to cram that into an iPhone interface is really difficult. And so what's interesting about this Photoshop app, this new Photoshop app, is it's not trying to do everything. It's doing, I think, a lot of the core tools and the core features of Photoshop, which the Photoshop Express kind of did. But this is, I think, when you're using this, the file you're going to create is going to be the file that you can open on your other devices. There's something about it being, this is legitimate Photoshop versus something that is trying to work with Photoshop.
Back in the day, Photoshop was synonymous with complicated. And I guess Quark Express was another one that got that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think even Karl Marx mentioned the complications of Photoshop in his 1847 work, Wage, Labor, and Capital, when he talked about, the complications of modern industrial whatever. But it was always the thing, like, people were afraid of it because of the name. And it almost seems deceptive that they've put it onto an iPhone. And you've shared your screen with me while we're doing this, and I can see there's 5 little buttons at the bottom and there's 6 little buttons at the top, and it looks like any kind of iPhone app. It doesn't look like Photoshop. And it makes me think that either the original Photoshop was overly complicated or this one is missing 80% of the features.
I would say yes, you're correct on both counts.
To both. Yeah. Because the thing is, if they're using the Photoshop name instead of Photoshop Express, Photoshop Elements, Photoshop Light, Photoshop Novice, whatever, they're implying that it does everything as the full Photoshop.
Yeah, kind of.
And that's not the case. And that's kind of deceptive.
It is a little bit. So to get into that, I want to sort of ask this question is, why would you want to use Photoshop on an iPhone? Some of this is Adobe can do this because it's their technology and more people are using phones now. I think one of the big reasons for this is you have an entire generation of photographers or people who are taking photos who want to do some editing, but the phone is the native device for them. They're not going to go and fire up a computer to do this. They want to make some edits on the phone. Now, I will fully admit to being old in this respect and think I can't see as much as I would want on my phone. But if you're trying to do something quickly, if you're trying to do something on a deadline, if you need to do something more complicated than what Lightroom will offer or the Photos app will offer, that's when you start thinking about something like this. And I think the core thing about Photoshop that a lot of apps don't do is working with layers, being able to create different layers that interact with each other in the way that Photoshop does, which can be extremely powerful, but you also really have to know what you're doing.
Right. And layers are what you use when you create masks to select things that, let's say you want to change the contrast on a background or select people's face and add more brightness, etc. But again, does it come with a magnifying glass? Because that phone screen is kind of tiny, and doing any sort of selection, you're zooming in as we talk about that. And that is one thing on an iPhone. You can zoom in a lot and you can get really close, but you don't have the bigger picture of what you're looking at. I just want to point out that I'm looking on the UK App Store, and it looks like this is £70 a year, Photoshop mobile and web. So the same price as the Like a Lux app that we talked about in our last episode. Does this mean you don't get it with your Lightroom subscription?
No, I think you do get it with a Lightroom subscription. I think if you're going to just buy it by itself, I think that might be the pricing.
Well, you're not buying, you're renting it.
Right,
but,
sorry, licensing it. One thing that I just realized while we're talking is, I can zoom in by, pinching and zooming with my fingers. If I turn the phone into the horizontal orientation, nothing changes. So if you are editing landscape photos, and landscape I mean orientation and or content, you can't take advantage of getting a wider screen by turning your phone sideways.
You sure you don't have rotation lock on?
I never have rotation lock on.
Adobe would actually do something like that for £70 or $70 a year. You can't edit sideways.
Nope. And actually, they implemented this in Lightroom too. And I think the reason was because nobody was actually doing it. And so if you're using the Lightroom app on your phone, you can turn it sideways and it will fill the screen, but it just shows you what your edited version looks like. There are no controls. You have to go back to the vertical orientation in order to actually do the editing. Again, these are some assumptions that I think are being made for people who use a phone natively in its portrait orientation natively and probably don't care whether you can see it big or not. And again, this is my old photographer brain thinking that's crazy, but maybe not.
Well, hold on now. Again, we're talking $70 a year. So apparently it's free with some basic features, $70 a year, which includes additional features on mobile and iPad along with access to Photoshop on the web. But there are plenty of other photo editing apps that you can get that are cheaper and may not even be subscription based. So are they just selling it by the name? Do you think Gen Z people want Photoshop on their phones. They're using Snapseed, or they're using all these other Chinese AI editing tools, and Photoshop, that's for old people.
Yeah. Well, I think that might be part of the reason this exists, because they want to expand this to people who may have heard of Photoshop, may know that they can do something more advanced, but won't really do anything that's not on a phone. And I think part of this too is they're also catering to the market of people who, they do have computers and they do have iPads, but I mean, honestly, there are many times when it would just be more convenient to make an edit on your phone, and you will know that it is going to be of high quality. So what I have not mentioned, and I probably should have, is the assumption that this is using Photoshop's technology, like the technology base, which really is some of the best in the world in terms of masking and color and like all of that. So that, like, I can't discount that. And so I think this also becomes a thing where if you are a professional photographer, you know that you can make an edit to something, make it using the tools that you're familiar with, more or less, and get a professional result that maybe you need to send off to a client, or you're on a deadline, or something where doing it on the phone is not going to mean that you have to fire up your laptop and copy something over or upload it to the cloud and stuff like that.
Okay, a couple questions. How does it access photos? Does it access them from your photos library, or does it use Adobe's cloud, and you have to have Adobe's cloud, and you're laughing because here's another complication of Photoshop on the iPhone.
I know. Well, I'm laughing because, yes, of course you have to use Adobe's cloud. No, sorry. That was reductive. Yes, you can pull things from your photos library. You can pull things from, from your photos, from Adobe stock. Get to that in a minute. You can generate an image because it'll do Firefly image generation. What's missing from this main home screen on the Photoshop app is Lightroom. There's no way that you can look at your Lightroom library and pull something in. Now, if you're in Lightroom, the Lightroom app,
you can send to
Photoshop.
Because you can do that with Lightroom on a computer. Yeah.
But I can't just say, I want to, hang on a minute. Scratch that.
I think we need to edit that. Yeah.
Well, actually, no, I'm not going to edit that because, here's the thing. When I'm looking at the interface here, it says, let's get started. And it has from your photos, new blank canvas, generate an image from Adobe stock, 4 buttons. That to me
then you
would
scroll
say,
down, you see a bunch of photos that you've already accessed or wherever they are.
Yeah. Then there's some from files, and those are stored up on the cloud. This demonstrates to me how difficult it is to do this on a small screen like this, because this makes me think these are my only options. But if I click a big blue plus button, I get those same options, but then I can scroll up.
Then you have to scroll up.
There's no indication that I could scroll up. I did that by accident.
Right.
And then I can see add from Lightroom or add from files. So you can actually...
Can you scroll up anymore?
Nope, that's it.
No, okay. You can also take a photo. So I assume that puts Photoshop in the Apple camera app pipeline and then imports it directly into Photoshop.
I don't think it uses the Apple photo. I think it has its own.
Oh, it's got its own camera.
Yeah. I mean, it's using the low level stuff to get to the camera, but it's like the same camera.
So it's not very good.
It's super basic.
It doesn't have as many options as Apple's camera app. So another thing I want to say, and we were saying if you want to do a quick edit, here's a scenario. Let's say you're a professional photographer, you're shooting events or something, and you dump your photos from your camera onto your iPhone, and maybe you want to run them through Photoshop to apply a preset before you upload them to whoever's going to work with them. In that case, you're not creating layers, you're not doing anything fancy, you're not using AI, but you just want to make the photos visible and usable by someone else as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Was there a question, or was that a yes? Yes, I think you're right.
So is that true? Question mark.
Yes, I think so. What I don't know and what I can't see is if there's any sort of a a batch function. So let's say, I have a photo from a photo shoot. It's underexposed, but I have a whole bunch of those. Would I be able to batch exposure and apply that to everything?
Which is one of the key features in Photoshop early on that made it so powerful.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and also we're straddling that line now of that is something that the Lightroom app can do, and you'd probably do that in Lightroom. So why would you even open it in Photoshop? And so now Photoshop has to justify
So you
itself.
need to have Photoshop and Lightroom and the Creative Cloud plan and all sorts of things.
Oh, yes.
So why even use Photoshop where you could do more with Lightroom?
Everything like works together, flows together, keeps you in the ecosystem, blah, blah, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But again, we come back to here we are in Photoshop. What would you do with it? And this would be where you want to do something with layers, or maybe you want to composite a couple of different images. You can't do that in Lightroom. And this also has the Photoshop's generative AI-based retouching, which tends to be very good if you need to remove somebody in the background, you need to remove somebody, period. In fact, okay, real quick, and I'll maybe try to get some screenshots of this while we're to put in the show notes. One thing I wanted to point out is this does not necessarily have like an edit screen where you would change colors and tone and all of that stuff because it's Photoshop. And so the way you would do that in Photoshop is you would create an adjustment layer, and then a layer would be for, let's say, brightness and contrast. And then I can bring up those controls. And so that just exists on a separate layer.
Okay, I just want to say that this interface is easier to use than Apple Photos. In the sense that
Yes.
I'm watching what you're doing, and it brings up the controls large instead of this thing you swipe on the bottom that's not really obvious, and plus it's in black in the Apple Photos app. So if you know what you're doing and you add a layer, add another adjustment layer,
Okay.
and you have options for hue and saturation, brightness and contrast, black and white, etc., color balance. Are there any more? Can you scroll up?
Yes, which
Exposure curves. So there's a whole bunch, which pretty much covers the main adjustments you want to make. So click on, there you go. You click on black and white. This interface to me is a lot easier to use than Apple's little interface at the bottom of the Photos app.
yeah, actually.
Big sliders.
And because it's Photoshop, there is more control over things, especially doing black and white. So I can brighten or darken the different hues.
Right. Apple Photos doesn't do that, but other apps do, like Photomator and Pixelmator
Yeah.
and plenty of other apps. I like the interface, which looks more airy to me
Yes.
and not as compressed as Apple Photos.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that.
And once you understand how layers work in Photoshop, then it makes more sense to do each one individually than that little swipe thing, or even on the Mac where you have the things on the side and there's so many things you can change. In some ways, having fewer options for adjustment could be better.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So the lighter Photoshop is, the better it is, because by nature, it's extremely complicated.
No, I think that really hits it on the head, and why they've really distilled a lot of the core features into this. I mean, I think we came into this saying, why would you even need a Photoshop? Why does this exist? And I think the answer to that is if you are in the Adobe system, the ecosystem, the industrial complex, that's the better way of saying it.
Adobe Industrial Complex, yeah.
Then this becomes a much more important tool in your arsenal, I guess, especially if you know how it works.
Well, if you have already internalized the idea of using adjustment layers, which there aren't a lot of apps on the iPhone or iPad that do, then this makes more sense because you're already thinking with that adjustment layer mindset.
Yeah. This pauses that I used the remove tool in order to just get rid of a person here, just to see what would happen. This is kind of like the big test of how does the remove tool work. And it looks like this is not the generative remove tool. This looks like it's just grabbing pixels from elsewhere in the image. So in our example, there are 3 people. I got rid of the person on the left, and what it did was it just basically cloned the person in the middle to try to make it fill that space, which is not.
Yeah, the Adobe website says you can edit with AI in this thing. Maybe you're just in the wrong place.
Maybe, but it's interesting that it does not have an option.
Because this sort of AI remove tool is incredibly common right now. I mean, pretty much every photo app does this.
Every photo app has this level of remove, which is mostly just grabbing pixels from elsewhere in the image. The thing that Adobe brings with the generative remove is it's using AI to actually create pixels out of nothing and tends to do better.
Right, but Apple's Photos does that now with its cleanup tool as well. Yeah, it's pretty common. Well, I guess they don't all have it, but it's pretty common now among apps.
I'm actually really surprised because I would expect that from Photoshop to do the generative, and maybe I don't know why it didn't do that.
So the AI, I'm just looking at some information. The AI it talks about is to create images with Firefly. It's not to use generative AI editing. And that's quite a weakness, actually, because Apple's cleanup tool is pretty good.
Apple's cleanup tool is pretty good. And actually, the Lightroom, in the Lightroom app, you have the option to use the generative AI remove. So it actually really surprises me that they didn't implement it into Photoshop. Okay,
now I'm watching you scroll around in the app, and are you still in Photoshop? Because now you've got a thing using generative AI.
Yeah, so I switched over to the Lightroom app for iPhone.
Okay.
Just to see what it would do, and actually
it's quite good.
It's quite good. It not only got rid of the person,
it added an arm to the person in the middle.
Exactly. That actually it looks realistic. It looks like it has the right number of fingers. So that's always good.
Well, you can't tell because there's one finger pointing, and it actually looks like an Elon Musk salute a bit.
Hey, now let's not make this a family unfriendly podcast. But the way Lightroom does this, it'll generate 3 different versions, so I can tap through and see.
Oh, okay.
None of the other ones are actually very good. That's actually more impressive there than I expected.
Yeah, but so you'd need to use Lightroom and Photoshop to be able to have these tools.
Yeah, exactly. So once again,
we're back where we were, that this is not good enough on its own unless you have really limited things that you want to do with it.
Yeah. If you think in layers and you think in Photoshop, this is the way to go. If you don't, and you're just a photographer who's doing 90% of the things that a photographer would do, Lightroom will get you there. So.
Okay, so you don't need Photoshop.
So you don't need Photoshop. There you go.
That's what Pablo Picasso said in 1932. He said, you don't need Photoshop. You can do it all yourself.
It's so prescient. So prescient.
All right, no snapshots this week because we're already over half hour and Jeff has to edit this. And he's busy with work. So I guess I'm not getting Photoshop in any case. I don't want another photo app. I do want to point out that we'll have an episode coming in May with a photographer who came to my house, and I was showing him the Lux app. I took a picture of him with the Lux app, and this is someone who is a professional photographer, and he was extremely impressed at the way that the lens emulation and the aperture depth of field emulation worked, and he was surprised how good it was. So that's our previous episode about the Lux grip in the app. And I guess that's enough for now. Until next time, Jeff.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to Photoactive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photoactive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast app.